Okay, so what's going on? We've talked about sleep, parents telling us there's problems, children not sleeping as long, children waking up more. What's this all about? What are the reasons for it? Because we have to find a cause, don't we? You can only really manage something and treat it if you know what the cause is. So in sleep medicine, we work to this classification. And just to give you a little bit of an insight, really, because people just think, my child has a sleep problem, I need to fix the sleep problem. They don't think, well, what's causing the sleep problem? And actually, there's a whole bunch of different reasons why. And when I teach doctors about sleep, I say, if you have a cough, you don't treat the cough. You try and find out, is it asthma? Is it a chest infection? Is it a tickly throat? They're all very different and they all have different treatments. And exactly the same is true for sleep disorders. So these are the kind of things that we're looking at. So breathing problems at night, we've talked about that already. Insomnia, difficulties falling asleep and difficulties staying asleep. It's in pink because I'm going to talk about that next. Being too sleepy in the day. So things like narcolepsy, rare disorders. Parasomnias, so things like sleep terrors, sleepwalking, where your body clock isn't working properly. We call those circadian rhythm disorders, and movement disorders and sleep. So, the trick, and I guess the sort of what I've spent my time doing, is trying to unpick, what's going on, because a lot of these things present in exactly the same way. Can't go to sleep, can't stay asleep, too tired in the day. And all of these things may potentially be involved in that. So I'm going to talk first of all about insomnia. The reason I'm talking about this is it is the commonest sleep disorder we see in children. Okay, you can bet your bottom dollar that no matter what the underlying developmental issues are, no matter what the underlying medical problems might be, insomnia is very often part of what we're seeing. And there is one that might be familiar with you when I start to tell the story. And this is the commonest insomnia that we see. And it's got a very kind of fancy long name, sleep onset association disorder. And the concept behind this is that every single one of us on this planet learns to fall asleep or has a preference for falling asleep in a very particular environment. Just stop and think for a second. When you settle yourself down to sleep, and in those kind of 10, 15 minutes before you go to bed, I bet you do something rather similar every night. Okay, most of you will have a habit. You'll like your bedroom a certain way, you'll like the lighting a certain way, some of you will want the radio on, you'll probably put yourself into a particular position in bed. And once that's all good, it makes it a wee bit easier to fall asleep. You've learned that association. And most of us in the Western world have pillows, don't we? That's a kind of cultural thing we do, not all over the world, but we tend to have a pillow. So good, all fine. You're in your bed, you've got your pillow, you settle down to sleep. Imagine you wake up after your natural night waking here, big blue arrow. So you've fallen asleep, everything's good. You've got your pillow, you've got whatever you like to go to sleep. You have your first natural night waking. We all do it. We do it probably every hour after this nice chunk of deep sleep. And your pillow's gone. You're not going to go back to sleep. You're going to feel quite anxious. Things will feel strange. Your bed will feel odd. You're not going to go back to sleep. And this is the idea behind sleep onset association disorder. Okay, so a lot of parents and children develop a sort of habit around settling the child to sleep. And I've done it as a parent, and lots of parents I see do it. We put a lot of effort into getting our child to sleep, and that might mean rocking, cuddling, soothing, musical toys, ceiling lights, warm milk, all of these things. And they work. They often work fantastically well. The child goes to sleep beautifully. Problem is, when you have that first night waking, the rocking isn't there anymore. The music isn't there anymore. The lights aren't there anymore. It's all gone. So you're not going to be able to fall asleep again because your metaphorical pillow has gone. And so what does the child do? I'm not comfortable. I can't go back to sleep. This isn't how I fall asleep. So they're going to shout and call for mum or dad or come out the room or whatever. And the parent's going to go in and do the whole thing all over again. Now, that might sound familiar to some of you, but it is the commonest sleep disorder we see. And so one of the simple tools of the trade, and I think every single parent at antenatal classes should be taught about this, is at the right time in a child's development. And it can happen as late as teenage years. It's never too late. But ideally, when the child is young, you get in there early and you encourage and help the child to learn to self-soothe themselves to sleep. And then once they've learnt that trick at the beginning of the night, and it should be lovely, you know, settling to sleep should be a lovely process. It doesn't have to be harsh, doesn't have to be scary. In fact, it absolutely shouldn't be. It should be a nice, soothing process. But the point is that the child settles in their bed independently, sleepy, but not quite asleep yet. And the parent, hopefully, by that point, is outside the room, assuming you don't want to co-sleep. And if you want to co-sleep, that's absolutely fine. That's your choice. But I guess it's kind of quite culturally common, isn't it, in the UK for people to want their children to sleep independently. But I'm a big believer in flexibility. You know, every family and every culture is different, so you'll all have your own views. But I think understanding this little trick and this little association is kind of very helpful and can be a big clue for people to move forwards. The other type is the limit setting type, and they often kind of mix up a little bit, actually. So in this one, instead of lots of wakings, children also struggle to fall asleep, and parents will say, you know, it's a nightmare getting this child to bed. You know, they're screaming and shouting, and they might be sick, they might be really upset, they're up and down the stairs, they're really very unhappy about going to bed. And the same will happen if they wake up at night. So the problem's at both ends. And, you know, we're all human, aren't we? And actually children respond to consistency. And isn't it difficult to be in real life? In real life, isn't it hard to be consistent, especially if you're exhausted? And so what often happens, we call this kind of like the gambling phenomena. You know, that idea that, you know, the old fashioned slot machines, fruit machines, you know, if the third time you pull the handle on the fruit machine, all the money pours out, you're going to think fantastic, and you're going to keep playing, aren't you? So, you know, if a child is really, really unhappy about going to bed and this isn't an anxious child or an ill child. This is a child who's feisty and strong and really knows that they can put up a good fight. And if they put up a good fight, they're going to get what they want. If they get what they want, they're going to keep putting up that fight because they know that if they keep pulling the handle, in other words, keep asking, they'll get what they want. And that is so difficult for parents that are very tired, but consistency around approaching this is terribly important. Okay, so we did some research a few years ago, and we were lucky enough to have a fantastic group of parents, almost 202 actually, just over 202 families across the country in Southampton. So it was based in Southampton Children's Hospital, Sheffield, and the Evelina. And some of you may have been involved in that study. We were looking at sleep and looking at breathing, particularly in sleep. And we had a group of infants and toddlers. So these were children under 2 years, 104 families, all completed a questionnaire about sleep behaviors. And we were able to compare them to a wonderful group of it was a wonderful study conducted by a woman in Brown University in the US, a psychologist who'd gathered data in the UK. And this was the really important thing. We wanted UK children that we could compare to our group of children with Down syndrome. And she had a big group of 489 children where families had answered exactly the same questionnaire, and we could match by gender and we could match by age and look at the differences. And parents told us about how their child slept and how they settled their child to sleep, both at the beginning of the night and if they woke up during the night. And what we found was that the children with Down syndrome had some really striking differences. So first of all, parents were much more likely to say they had sleep problems, 45% of parents compared to 19% of the non-Down syndrome children. Much more likely to have snoring. That was no big surprise because we know that's an issue. But the really shocking thing for me was that they had 55 minutes less sleep at night than their typically developing peer. And do you remember I was saying 45 minutes, you see really big differences in children. 55 minutes is a big difference. And what was happening was they were shifting some of their nighttime sleep into the day, so they were having more day naps. But even if you added on the day naps to try and bulk out how much sleep they were getting in 24 hours, they were still having almost 40 minutes less sleep. So this was a real difference, we felt, in total sleep time. And they were much more likely to have problems. That OR means odds ratio. It's a fancy bit of statistics, but for simplicity, I'll say approximately twice as likely to have problems settling to sleep. So then there's the big why question, isn't there? Why was this? Now, the study was just observational, so we couldn't truly answer that in any detail, but we could get some clues from how parents answered the questionnaires. So hopefully I can get my slide on. Here we go. So we asked about how parents were settling their child to sleep. And just bear in mind that thing I talked about, the pillow analogy, you know, that situations that are there in the room when you fall asleep, you need to have there again when you wake up in the night. So the parents of children with Down syndrome in the study were more likely to bottle feed their child to sleep. This would have been the younger children, almost 5 times as likely. Much more likely, almost 6 times as likely to be rocking their child or holding their child. To have a parent alongside, so the child was in their bed but the parent was lying next to them, or to be in the parent's bed to settle to sleep. And so we kind of put all that stuff together and said, well, how much more likely were parents to be kind of with their child at the point the child settled to sleep? And it was 4 times, or a bit more than 4 times more likely. So, you know, the non-Down syndrome children, about 25% of parents were still quite involved in settling, because these are young children, remember, but it was much more striking in the children with Down syndrome. So that was kind of interesting. So I guess the received wisdom, if you look at all the medical literature, there's a bit of a simple kind of interpretation of this. People think, well, okay, the biggest problem in children with Down syndrome is this sleep apnea thing. We all know about that. So surely all the sleep problems to do with sleep apnea. And that's where most of the research has been. But this study kind of said something slightly different, actually, in terms of explaining why we were seeing these problems with this shorter sleep. Remember that number of 40 minutes less sleep across the 24 hours. We looked to see whether snoring explained the difference, because if this was all a sleep apnea problem, okay, we know what we're dealing with. We can manage that. We can do something about that. Snoring didn't affect any aspects of sleep other than night waking, which you would expect. Okay, so children that snored a lot were more likely to wake up, and that was true for all children. But whether or not the mum or dad were there when the child settled to sleep explained later bedtimes, more frequent and longer night wakings, shorter periods of uninterrupted sleep. That's a kind of a funny concept, isn't it? But we know now that the more kind of consolidated sleep you have, the better your sleep is. And no compensatory increase in day naps. And actually, once we'd kind of looked at this, it actually explained an hour less of sleep overall. And this was true across the children. So if the parents were very engaged in the child settling to sleep, those children had around an hour less sleep overall. So is that chicken or is that egg? Because, you know, I kind of talked to you about the sleep onset association, and, you know, it sounds a bit like I'm pointing the finger of blame, doesn't it? You know, how you settle your child to sleep means they don't get so much sleep. But of course, it could be the other way around. You know, if you've got a child that's very difficult to settle inherently for some other reason, you're going to respond in a different way. You know, and I think an interesting, you know, quite often I'll see children where there are multiple siblings in the family, and this particular child, for whatever reason, is different. So, you know, all children have different personalities and different temperaments and different needs, and that can drive how, you know, the kind of dance, if you like, between the parent and child, and how those behaviors play out in the night. So we don't know that from this research. It wasn't designed to tell us that one way or another. But if we look at the other literature, in typically developing children, we absolutely know that parent behavior at bedtime will affect how a child settles and how a child manages their natural night wakings. And we know, as I've mentioned, that all of those lovely strategies like rocking and very, what I think of as effortful settling, you know, working hard to get your child to sleep, they're really effective. They get the child to sleep, but the child hasn't learned that magic skill to self-soothe at night and struggles then when they wake up. And as I've said, all of these things are, it sounds very simple, but actually in real life it's more complex, isn't it? Because we all have our cultural norms, you know, how you were settled as a child, the kind of routine that you had, your beliefs about your child. You know, if I think a really powerful, important belief is if you see your child as unwell or fragile, or if they are unwell, you know, if you've had a child who's had a really difficult first year of life, if they've had cardiac surgery, if you've had a really difficult, stressful time, it's damn difficult to sort of switch the light off and say, night, night, I'm sorry, you know, time for bed now. That is very difficult to do. And it's much more human and natural to want to you know, cradle and rock your child. So these things are quite complex. And as I said, it'll really depend on a child's temperament as well. And they're all different, aren't they? And of course, we know as well that children with Down syndrome are at more risk of things like autism spectrum disorder and problems like ADHD. And those things all have independent impacts on sleep and bedtime. Okay.